Welcome to Chapter 2, Understanding Ethical and Legal Considerations. This chapter is about something that often gets underestimated in technical writing, the idea that our writing has consequences. Technical communication isn't just about clarity or correctness, it's about responsibility. The words we choose, the visuals we include, and even what we decide not to say can affect people's safety, finances, privacy, and decision making. Ethical and legal issues aren't rare, extreme situations that only apply to scandals or lawsuits. They show up in everyday workplace documents, manuals, instructions, proposals, emails, websites, and even social media posts. Sometimes the ethical problem is obvious, like lying about a product's safety. Other times it's more subtle, like using vague language that quietly downplays risk or exaggerates benefits. This chapter gives us a framework for thinking through those situations before they become problems. It's not about turning you into lawyers or ethicists, it's about helping you recognize when a communication choice carries ethical or legal weight and how to respond responsibly. To start building this framework, this chapter lays out what you should be able to do by the end. These three learning objectives gives us a roadmap for the chapter. By the end, you should be able to define ethics and ethical conduct, not just in theory, but as they apply to real workplace situations. You should be able to apply ethical considerations to your own career, regardless of your major or industry. You'll also learn to identify your ethical and legal obligations at work, specifically your obligations to your employer, to the public, and to the environment. Those categories matter because ethical responsibility doesn't point in just one direction. Another key goal is being able to list and explain the major principles of ethical communication. These principles show up again and again in professional writing: truthfulness, clarity, accessibility, fairness, and accountability. Finally, you'll explore how ethical communication becomes more complicated when it crosses cultures and media, especially digital and social media spaces where information spreads quickly and permanently. These objectives aren't abstract. You'll see them appear throughout the course, especially in your major projects. Before we talk about obligations and laws, though, we need a shared understanding of what ethics actually means. So, what is ethical communication anyway? At its core, ethics is the study of principles of conduct, how people ought to behave. Some people think of ethics as gut instinct or personal values, others connect it to religion or the Golden Rule. In professional settings, though, ethics requires more than intuition. It requires deliberate reasoning. In technical communication, ethical communication usually shows up through very practical concerns. Are we telling the truth? Are we being clear instead of intentionally vague? Are we giving users the information they need to stay safe? Are we respecting readers' abilities, limitations, and rights? Ethical communication also means recognizing that being technically accurate is not always enough. A statement can be legally defensible and still ethically misleading. That's why this chapter keeps returning to the idea that writers must think carefully about how readers are likely to interpret and use information, not just whether the information is technically correct. To help with that kind of thinking, ethicists have proposed some broad standards for evaluating ethical decisions. The chapter introduces four major moral standards that are commonly used to think through ethical dilemmas: rights, justice, utility, and care. The rights standard focuses on basic needs and entitlements, things like the right to accurate information or a reasonably safe product. The justice standard asks whether benefits and burdens are distributed fairly. The utility standard looks at consequences: who benefits, who is harmed, and whether an action creates more good than harm overall. And the care standard emphasizes relationships and responsibilities, especially to people we are closely connected to. What's important here is not memorizing definitions. What matters is realizing that these standards often conflict. A decision that maximizes overall benefit might still be unfair to a particular group. A decision that shows care for one person might violate fairness to others. Ethical dilemmas exist precisely because there isn't always a single, obvious, right answer. Technical communicators have to weigh these competing values when making decisions. Because those decisions come up constantly in professional writing, the chapter offers a more practical set of guiding principles. This slide lists 11 principles for ethical communication, and you should think of these as a professional checklist, not a memorization exercise. Together, these principles emphasize a few core ideas. You must abide by relevant laws, especially those governing intellectual property, contracts, and liability. You must comply with accessibility standards, ensuring that people with disabilities can access and use information. You should follow professional codes of conduct and your organization's social media policies. You should tell the truth and avoid misleading language, whether through exaggeration, vague wording, or design choices that hide important information. Several of these principles highlight that clarity itself is an ethical responsibility. Being unclear, overly technical, or intentionally confusing can cause real harm. Others remind us to avoid discriminatory language and to acknowledge assistance from others honestly. These principles will come back throughout the course. They're not just theory, they're tools you'll use when making real writing decisions in real-world contexts. Now that we've talked about general ethical principles, the chapter shifts to something more concrete: your ethical obligations as an employee. This is an important move because ethical communication doesn't happen in a vacuum. Most technical communicators work inside organizations, companies, schools, hospitals, government agencies, and those contexts shape what we write and why we write. The chapter organizes ethical responsibility into 3 categories: obligations to your employer, obligations to the public, and obligations to the environment. This framework is useful because ethical tensions often arise between these groups. What benefits an employer in the short term might harm the public. What protects profits might increase environmental damage. Understanding ethics in professional writing means recognizing that you're often balancing competing responsibilities and that ethical decision-making requires awareness, not just good intentions. As an employee, and especially as a technical communicator, you don't have just one ethical responsibility, you have 3. Responsibilities to your employer, to the public, and to the environment. These obligations exist at the same time, and they don't always point in the same direction. Your employer expects you to support the organization's legitimate goals and represent it professionally. At the same time, the public depends on accurate, clear, and honest information to make safe and informed decisions. And beyond that, organizations and employees have responsibilities to the environment, especially when their work contributes to pollution, waste, or long-term harm. Ethical challenges arise precisely because these responsibilities can come into conflict. Something that benefits an employer in the short term might put the public at risk or contribute to environmental damage. This chapter doesn't pretend those tensions are easy to resolve, but it gives you a framework for recognizing them and responding thoughtfully rather than blindly. We'll start by looking more closely at your ethical obligations to your employer. The chapter identifies 5 key obligations you have to your employer. First is competence and diligence. You are ethically obligated to have the skills required for your job and to work honestly and consistently, not just appear busy. Cutting corners or misrepresenting work is an ethical failure. Second is generosity, which might sound unusual, but it means sharing knowledge appropriately. Helping coworkers, responding carefully to questions, and contributing expertise supports both ethical culture and organizational success. Third is honesty and candor. This includes reporting problems that could affect safety or quality, even when doing so is uncomfortable. The chapter gives examples like manipulating research data, practices that may benefit an organization short term but are deeply unethical. Fourth is confidentiality. Sensitive information about products, finances, or personnel must be protected because misuse can cause real harm. Finally, there is loyalty. Loyalty means acting in your employer's interest, but not at the cost of ethical behavior. When organizations act unethically, employees may have an obligation to challenge that behavior rather than protect it. But your responsibilities don't stop with your employer. In addition to obligations to your employer, you also have ethical obligations to the public. At the most basic level, organizations have a responsibility to provide products and services that are safe and effective. Safe means they do not injure or harm users. Effective means they do what they claim to do. What complicates this is the imbalance of knowledge. Manufacturers and organizations almost always know more about their products than consumers do. Because of that, courts and ethicists generally place greater responsibility on organizations to warn users, explain risks, and communicate clearly. For technical communicators, this means that instructions, manuals, warnings, and descriptions are not just informational. They are ethical documents. When communication fails, people can be injured, misled, or financially harmed. Ethical writing helps prevent that. The final category is obligations to the environment. In your day-to-day work, you might not personally cause pollution or resource depletion, but you may know how your organization's actions affect the environment through manufacturing processes, waste disposal, energy use, or product design. The chapter argues that communicators should treat actual or potential environmental damage seriously. That means alerting supervisors to risks, participating honestly in environmental documentation, and not using vague or misleading language to minimize harm. This obligation is especially challenging because environmental protection often conflicts with short-term cost savings. Ethical communication in this context means resisting pressure to cut corners in how environmental impacts are described or addressed. Environmental responsibility, like public safety, is part of what it means to communicate ethically in the real world. Up to this point, we've been talking mainly about ethics, what professionals ought to do. Now the chapter shifts to something closely related but not identical, your legal obligations. Ethical and legal obligations overlap, but they aren't the same thing. Something can be legal but still unethical, like writing a statement that's technically true but designed to mislead. And something can be ethical but not strictly legal, depending on context. So, in technical communication, you have to think about both, not just one. As a technical communicator, the goal is not to become a legal expert. The goal is to understand enough to avoid obvious problems, recognize legal risk early, and know when your organization needs legal guidance. This slide gives you a big picture view of the four bodies of law that matter most in technical communication: copyright, trademark, contract, and liability. What's important here is not just the list of terms, but the idea that these legal areas work together and often pull against each other, which is why they're shown balanced on a scale. Copyright law governs the use of intellectual property: text, images, video, and design. Trademark law protects names, logos, and symbols that identify companies and products. Contract law deals with promises and agreements, especially warranties and claims about what products or services can do. And liability law focuses on responsibility for harm, especially whether users were adequately warned and instructed. As technical communicators, we often sit right in the middle of these forces. A single document, like a manual or website, can involve all four at once. This slide is setting up the idea that legal responsibility in professional writing is systemic, not isolated, and that decisions in one area can affect risk in another. So what about situations where people use a small portion of copyrighted work, like quotes for teaching or commentary? That's where fair use comes in. Fair use is one of the most misunderstood parts of copyright law because people want it to be a simple rule, and it isn't. Fair use is based on case-by-case judgment, and courts consider multiple factors. The chapter highlights 4 factors courts typically weigh. First, the purpose and character of the use, especially whether it's commercial or nonprofit, and whether it transforms the original material. Second, the nature of the copyrighted work. Certain kinds of material are treated differently, especially when the information has strong public importance. Third, the amount and substantiality used, not just how much you use, but whether you used the heart of the work. And fourth, the effect on the market, whether your use undermines the original creator's ability to profit. So the key takeaway is this: you don't assume fair use because something is short, or because it's online, or because you're just using it for school. You use fair use carefully and responsibly, and you cite the source accurately either way. Another practical layer here is licensing, especially Creative Commons, which tries to make reuse clearer. A trend the chapter points out is that many creators now attach licenses that specify what others are allowed to do with their work. One of the best known systems is Creative Commons. Creative Commons doesn't mean free for anything. It means the creator is explicitly stating which rights they keep and which rights they allow others to use. Some licenses allow reuse but require attribution. Some allow remixing or adaptation, while others don't. Some allow commercial use, and others forbid it. The point is, a license is a permission structure, not a free-for-all. The chapter's broader advice here is verify ownership and don't assume that everything on the internet was uploaded legally or that the person posting it actually owns it. And it also includes a very modern reminder. When using generative AI, you need to understand who owns what and what your organization's standards are, because copyright and ownership questions get complicated quickly. So what should a responsible professional do in real life when pulling in outside content? The chapter gives some practical guidance. First, verify ownership. Don't assume a graphic or passage is safe to use just because it's easy to copy. Second, respect fair use, but don't stretch it. Fair use is not a loophole to rely on large amounts of someone else's work unless it's legitimately your organization's own reusable boilerplate. Third, seek permission when needed and do it in writing. Many organizations will charge, and that's normal. Fourth, cite sources accurately. Citation is ethically necessary, and it also strengthens credibility by showing the reader you're grounded in real research. And finally, consult legal counsel when appropriate, because copyright law is complex and companies often have higher legal standards than whatever a random website claims is allowed. The chapter also reminds you that internal reuse in a company can be ethical, like reusing boilerplate language, because the company owns that text. But even then, you should learn your organization's culture and check with supervisors when needed. Now we shift from copyright to trademark law, which serves a different purpose. While copyright protects creative work, trademarks protect identity. A trademark is a word, phrase, name, or symbol that identifies a company or product and distinguishes it from competitors. When you see a familiar logo or product name, you are seeing a trademark doing its job, helping the public recognize the source of a product. The chapter distinguishes between a trademark, which uses the TM symbol, and a registered trademark, which uses the R symbol and has been formally registered with the U.S. Patent and Trademarks Office. Registration provides stronger legal protection, but even unregistered trademarks matter. For technical communicators, trademarks are not just a legal concern for lawyers or marketing teams. We use product names, logos, and brand identifiers constantly in documentation, manuals, proposals, and web content. Using them incorrectly can weaken legal protection and expose organizations to risk. Because of that, the chapter gives very specific guidance on how communicators should handle trademarks in practice. This slide focuses on practical habits that can help protect trademarks through everyday writing. First, trademarked items should be distinguished visually, using formatting like capitalization, boldface, or consistent styling, so readers recognize them as brand identifiers. Second, writers should use the appropriate trademark symbol at least once per document, usually the first time the name appears, and include a clarifying note if necessary. Third, and this is especially important, trademarks should be used as adjectives, not nouns or verbs. For example, you buy a LaserJet printer, not a LaserJet. When trademarks become generic nouns, companies can lose legal protection. Finally, avoid using the possessive form of a trademark name because that also encourages people to treat it as a generic term. These may seem like small stylistic choices, but they have real legal consequences. Next, the chapter turns to another legal area that technical communicators influence directly: contracts and warranties. Contract law governs agreements between parties, and in technical communication, it most often appears through warranties, claims about what a product or service will do. An express warranty is a direct statement, written or spoken, that promises a specific feature or level of performance. If documentation says a printer produces 20 pages per minute, that's an express warranty. An implied warranty isn't stated outright but is assumed. The chapter describes two key types: the warranty of merchantability, which guarantees basic quality and functionality, and the warranty of fitness, which applies when a seller knows the buyer's specific purpose and implies suitability. For communicators, this means that every claim in documentation matters. Overstating capabilities, using vague superlatives, or implying performance that hasn't been tested can create legal and ethical problems. Precision here isn't just good writing, it's legal protection. Closely connected to warranties is the idea of law that often matters most for safety: liability. Liability law focuses on responsibility for harm. Under product liability law, manufacturers and sellers can be held responsibility for injuries or damages caused by their products. This is where technical communication becomes especially important. Courts frequently rule that manufacturers have a duty to warn users about risks associated with normal use of a product. If instructions are unclear, warnings are buried, or risks are downplayed, the documentation itself can become part of the legal problem. The chapter emphasizes that communicators play a central role here. Instructions, manuals, labels, and warnings are not neutral add-ons. They are part of how an organization fulfills its legal and ethical responsibility to users. The chapter then outlines what it means to take that responsibility seriously in practice. This slide translates liability law into concrete actions that technical communicators are responsible for. What's important to notice is that every item here is an action verb. These are things writers actively do, not abstract legal ideas. First, you must understand the product and its likely users. That means learning how the product actually works and how real people, not ideal users, will interact with it. Second, you must describe the product's functions and its limitations. Liability problems often arise not from what companies say, but from what they fail to say. Third, you must instruct users on all aspects of ownership, including installation, use, maintenance, emergencies, and disposal, not just basic operation. Fourth, you must use appropriate words and graphics. Clear language and effective visuals are not optional. They're essential to helping users avoid harm. Fifth and sixth, you must warn users about risks and include warnings alongside claims of safety. When writers emphasize safety without balancing it with warnings, courts tend to see that as misleading. Seventh, directions and warnings must be conspicuous, not hidden in fine print or footnotes. Eighth, instructions must comply with standards and laws, which may differ by country or region. Ninth, organizations must perform usability testing on both products and instructions. And finally, if new risks emerge, companies must update users because ethical responsibility doesn't end when a product ships. This slide introduces the idea that ethical and legal behavior in organizations does not happen by accident. It is shaped by corporate culture. The graphic you're seeing here is meant to represent how influence flows inside an organization. The larger figure at the top symbolizes organizational leadership, and the arrows pointing downward represent how values, expectations, and norms move through the company to supervisors and employees. The chapter emphasizes that organizations exert a powerful influence on how employees behave. Research shows that companies with strong ethical cultures experience fewer ethical problems, less pressure to commit misconduct, and more willingness among employees to report problems when they occur. The key takeaway here is that ethics isn't just about individual character. Even well-intentioned people can make poor ethical choices when they work in environments that reward cutting corners or discourage speaking up. Corporate culture shapes what feels acceptable, what feels risky, and what feels expected in day-to-day work. So how do organizations actually build a culture that supports ethical and legal behavior? That's what the next slide breaks down. This pyramid shows that ethical culture must be actively promoted at every level of an organization, not just stated in a policy or handbook. At the top of the pyramid is ethical leadership. Leaders set the tone by modeling ethical behavior and making it clear, through their actions, not just words, that ethics matter. Below that is supervisor reinforcement. Supervisors play a crucial role because they translate abstract values into everyday decisions. Employees watch how supervisors respond to problems, mistakes, and ethical concerns. Next is peer support. Coworkers influence one another constantly, and ethical behavior is more likely when peers support doing the right thing rather than rewarding shortcuts. At the base of the pyramid are reinforced ethical values, formal policies, codes of conduct, training, and communication that keep ethical expectations visible and consistent. The chapter's point is simple but important. Ethics only work when they're embedded into daily practice. A code of conduct alone is not enough unless it's supported from the top down and reinforced through the organization. One area where ethical culture is especially tested today is social media. This slide shifts our focus to social media, which the chapter describes as both an opportunity and a risk in professional life. Social media allows organizations and employees to connect quickly with the public, but it also creates new ethical and legal challenges because information spreads rapidly and is difficult to control once posted. The chapter points out that most employers now have social media policies, and many have had to discipline employees for misuse. Ethical problems can arise when employees reveal confidential information, misrepresent their employer, engage in false endorsements, or post content that harms others. A key idea here is that something can feel informal or personal, like a social media post, but still carry professional and legal consequences. Courts increasingly treat online posts as published communication, which means they can trigger legal obligations related to copyright, defamation, contracts, and liability. Because of those risks, the chapter offers concrete best practices for using social media responsibly. This slide focuses on practical guidelines for protecting yourself and your employer when using social media. One major recommendation is to keep personal and company sponsored accounts separate so ownership and responsibility are clear. Another is to read the terms of service of platforms carefully, since many allow reposting of your content in ways employers may not approve. The chapter also warns against revealing unauthorized company information, even casually, because online posts can trigger legal consequences like patent deadlines or investor reactions. Writers are also cautioned to avoid self plagiarism, false endorsements, impersonation, trademark misuse, and defamation. Even reposting someone else's defamatory content can be legally risky. The underlying message is this: before posting, assume the content is public, permanent, and professionally attributable to you. This slide introduces one of the most challenging areas of ethical technical communication: working across cultures. When organizations operate internationally, they don't just encounter different languages, they encounter different ethical norms, social expectations, and legal frameworks. What seems normal or acceptable in one culture may be viewed very differently in another. The chapter makes an important distinction here. Companies are not ethically obligated to challenge every cultural norm they encounter, but they are obligated to avoid reinforcing practices that cause harm, especially discrimination. This idea is referred to as the moral minimum, the baseline ethical responsibility organizations have regardless of local customs. At the same time, ethical communication across cultures requires sensitivity. Organizations should avoid unnecessarily provoking or offending audiences, even while remaining ethically responsible. The takeaway is that global technical communication requires balance, respecting cultural differences while refusing to contribute to harm. This slide focuses on situations where ethical beliefs conflict across cultures. The chapter gives an example involving gender roles. In some countries, women are excluded from certain public or professional roles. A company creating product documentation for those regions must decide how to represent people visually and rhetorically. The key argument here is that companies should not reinforce discrimination in their communication. Excluding women entirely from product information, for example, would ethically support harmful patterns. However, the chapter also makes clear that organizations are not required to take an activist stance in every situation. They don't have to deliberately provoke local norms, but they should avoid endorsing injustice through their materials. For technical communicators, this means thinking carefully about images, examples, language, and assumptions. Ethical choices are often embedded in seemingly small design situations. To wrap up this lesson, it's worth stepping back and connecting today's material to the broader goals of this course. Today, we've learned that technical writing is never neutral. It operates at the intersection of ethics, law, audience, and real world consequences. We explored how technical communicators have responsibilities not just to their employers, but also to the public and to the environment, and how these responsibilities can sometimes come into conflict. We also looked at how legal frameworks like copyright, trademark, contract, and liability law shape what writers can and cannot do, and why clarity, accuracy, and visibility are ethical obligations, not just stylistic preferences. We examined how corporate culture influences ethical behavior, how social media complicates professional responsibility, and how global communication introduces new ethical and legal challenges. All of this connects directly to our course level essential questions. What does it mean to write ethically in real world contexts? How do audience, genre, and purpose shape communication? And how do writers make complex information usable without causing harm? As we move into upcoming projects, these questions won't disappear. They'll guide how you adapt information, propose change, and design instructions that people actually rely on. Ethics isn't a separate unit, it's part of every decision technical communicators make.